As promised, final guest of the morning is Congressman Rush Holt of New Jersey. He's a Democrat who has long been interested in how America votes and is proposing a series of reforms in time for the '08 election. Mr. Holt, thanks very much for being with us.
It's good to be with you, Susan.
The current law is called the Help America Vote Act, which put into play the movement from a lot of paper balloting to electronic balloting across the United States. First of all, how does that process stand based on what happened last week, and what do you want to change about it?
The Help America Vote Act was passed after the 2000 election. It was intended to do away with the butterfly ballots and the hanging chads and some of those problems. It corrected some, it created some others, and it failed to address some more. So there's more work to be done. The unintended consequences of the HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, are that it led many jurisdictions around the country, states and counties, to go out and buy electronic voting machines that are clear, simple, easy to use, and totally unverifiable. So that, as we see in Florida right now, where there is an election in dispute, where thousands of people, far more than the margin separating the two candidates right now, thousands of people did not vote in the congressional race, according to the numbers, even though they voted in the races above and below. So there's something fishy, at least, or questionable, but it cannot be resolved because there's no paper trail. There's no way to know what the voters' intentions were. So some legislation that, well, now a majority of the members of the House of Representatives have co-sponsored is a bill that would provide for a voter-verified paper audit trail. I mean, anything of value should be auditable. This would help ensure that elections are not only reliable and accessible, but also auditable. Other things that need to be done.
Before you leave that,
yeah.
Who's going to pay for that? Because I'm sure there's enormous cost to either buy, yet again, new machines or retrofit old ones.
Well, just as in Help America Vote Act, there is authorized in the legislation that I've introduced that has so many co-sponsors, some federal assistance for the either purchase or retrofitting of machines or acquiring other systems. It doesn't have to be a touchscreen machine for voting. Under the Constitution, the voting is determined state by state. The HAVA provided some assistance, but ultimately it's primarily up to the local jurisdiction, the county and the state, to make sure that there are voting systems that are reliable and accessible. And one thing HAVA did was improve the accessibility of voting for people with physical disabilities, for example. That's a good thing. And it should be auditable, and that's what we're trying to add now.
And what else is needed for reform?
Well, a number of things. There is still old-fashioned deception and intimidation. Senator Barack Obama in the Senate and I in the House have introduced legislation that would make it a criminal offense to intentionally mislead voters, send them to the wrong polling places, things of that sort. And it would give an individual voter the legal right of action, which would be a big deal. I have other legislation that would require that provisional ballots be counted. Under the HAVA, if your name is not on the registration list, but you think you should be allowed to vote, HAVA requires that you be given a provisional ballot. It does not require that that ballot be counted. And in some states, they have not been counted. I have legislation that would require not only that a voter could go to any reasonably close polling place and get a provisional ballot, but also would require that those ballots be counted. I have other legislation that requires that there be adequate voting devices in each polling place and that they be equitably distributed so that voters in poor neighborhoods don't have to stand in line for many hours, whereas those in wealthier neighborhoods can breeze in and out. So there are a number of things of that sort. I have other legislation that would look at what happens between the closing of the polls and the tallying of the votes by the county clerk. There's a dark space in there where almost anything can happen, arithmetic error or other things. It should be made transparent so that concerned citizens can watch the process.
Overall, since we're in the midst of a transition, that the law required, what kind of a grade would you give this country's last election day?
Well, there are still 6 or 8
unfinished races.
Unfinished congressional races, a number of local races. So, of course, the answer is it's too early to tell. But we know there are problems. The Florida race that I mentioned before, I think, cannot be resolved satisfactorily. There are going to be people on one side or the other who forever will dispute or suspect the outcome, the declared outcome, because there's no paper trail that will allow a judge to go back and determine the voters' intentions. How that will be resolved is up to the courts, but I think there is no satisfactory resolution. There are a number of other races around the country where there's similar but maybe less dramatic problems.
I've got a copy of your legislation, which is as yet unnumbered. Will it be introduced in the new Congress? Is that the plan for it?
Well, unless we pass it during this lame duck session.
And is that possible?
Oh, it's possible. Anything's possible. I think it's unlikely, although, as I said, a majority of the current members of the House of Representatives and are co-sponsors, and many of the incoming members have expressed their support for it. Those people who will be in authority and power in the Democratic Party say they want to pass it in short order. So if it's not passed during the lame duck session, I think it will be passed early in the next session. And the earlier the better, because it takes time for the local election officials to get things in place.
We have this bill hyperlinked on our website if you're interested in reading the particulars, but so many of you are fresh from the voting experience and I'm sure have opinions about how it worked and what kind of reforms you think are needed. So let's get to your telephone calls. I'm going to begin with a call from Baton Rouge on the Republican line. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, Mr. Holt, I guess what's the most important thing is when you get into the voting booth, what happens to a person. And until you get in there, I'm a college graduate, and I still am always amazed at how confusing it looks upon entering the booth. And I was thinking, if you were going to ask for a reform, I was thinking perhaps you could make a CD for Spanish and English speaking people, informing them before the fact, so that when they do get inside, they'll know exactly where to go, what to do, because it is rather a confusing thing. But I think your bill is very good, and I hope it's successful, sir.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. There are obviously a lot of considerations about usability or user interfaces. And there are experts, psychologists, engineers, and others who spend their time trying to make machines transparent or usable. And I think in many jurisdictions around the country, we need to do a better job. It's hard to know how to do that by legislation from the federal level. Certainly local watchdog groups and voting rights and voting information groups can help. And we need to do a better job of civics education in the United States.
Johnson City, Tennessee. We're talking about voting machines. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. I hope that you have in your legislation something that will prevent them from selling like a mailing list, a voter list, who voted for who. And also, please do something about the absentee ballots. My niece is a nurse, walked in, challenged a man in a woman's room, and she happened to notice the ballot is filled out as a Republican ballot, as in 2000. The lady was in a coma. She voted Republican, though. But one other thing, off the subject just a hair, please check and see that laundry list of WMDs. How many of them were the things that Rumsfeld negotiated with Saddam?
Okay, good jump in at that point, sir. Thanks very much. Concerned about absentee ballots.
There were more absentee votes cast, I believe, around the country by a large margin than in previous elections. Partly, I think, because people were distrustful of the machines that 40% of the voters were asked to use that did not have any paper trail, did not have auditability. The problem with relying on absentee ballots, and I cast an absentee ballot myself this year, But the problem with absentee ballots is that you lose, or you might lose, privacy. It opens the door for coercion and fraud. And so you have to have additional safeguards built in. But it is not as good as I think, voting behind a curtain in a booth in complete privacy.
Your staff sent in a message that, in fact, the bill has been numbered. It's H.R. 550, for those of you who know how to work the system and use online to find the text of legislation. H.R. 550 is the number of this bill. We were talking on the break that we had a call earlier in the program concerned about counting military votes. You know a little bit about that process.
It's a real problem how to cast votes efficiently and easily from overseas and still make them secure. What the Pentagon made available this year for military voters was insecure, so that voters' identity, perhaps even their actual votes, the secrecy of their votes, could be compromised. And it would make it possible to make them vulnerable to identity theft. A number of computer scientists took a look at the plan that was proposed 2 years ago and said that it was all wrong, and so the Pentagon pulled it back. This year, without consulting any of the experts, as far as I know, they came out with a different plan that was at least as insecure as the previous one they had. And this is something that I think we've got to devote a lot of attention to, because we clearly want these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, Americans overseas, to be able to vote in the elections. But we must make sure that that vote is secret, secure, that they are not subjecting themselves to identity theft, and that the votes will be counted as intended.
Well, speaking of scientists, the congressman is himself one. Before coming to the House of Representatives, he served as assistant director of Princeton's Plasma Physics Laboratory, the largest research facility at Princeton University. And he, over the course of his academic career, conducted extensive research on alternative energy. His PhD is in physics from New York University?
New York University,
right.
Yes.
In 1981. Are you the only physicist in the House of Representatives, as far as you know?
No, Vern Ehlers, Republican from Michigan, and we joke that we comprise the Bipartisan Physics Caucus.
Let's take our next call for you. It's from Hayes, Virginia. Good morning, caller. You're on the air.
Thank you, Susan. I would just like to comment that the problem with elections is that we have allowed it to become a federalized issue. That is an issue the states should deal with. And once the federal government becomes involved in it, they dump a lot of money to the states. We have the fiasco of, computers and those kinds of things, no audit trails. It seems to me that Congress should just get out of that business and allow the states to conduct elections. If there is some issue of unfairness or what have you, it seems that it should be an issue for the Justice Department. So I would just recommend that Congress get out of the elections business. Thank you.
Well, I think there's a long history and a good history of federal involvement. As I said, under the Constitution, elections are primarily the responsibility of the state. But going back to the constitutional amendments that were passed after the Civil War to make sure that the freed slaves could vote, on up through the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the federal government has been involved when it's been clear that major fundamental American principles are at stake. And the Voting Rights Act, I think, has been a success. It's not without controversy and not without difficulty, but it's been a success. It was recently renewed. I think that's important. The HAVA, Help America Vote Act, is another case in point where it was clear that local jurisdictions just weren't doing it right, and as a result, people were being disenfranchised. The fundamental act of democracy was being compromised. So I think it was appropriate to pass HAVA. As I say, it was imperfect. It has some shortcomings. I think we will amend it and correct some of those shortcomings as best we know how.
Belmar, New York, Democrats line, good morning.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I was up a couple of nights for the last 6 months worrying that the elections would be stolen again, or something, close to that in a number of races. And just the opposite of what the other person was speaking about, I think this obviously should be a federalized issue. And, Costco, if I walk into a Costco in Florida, they could tell me what I bought in the last 5 years, even though every item I bought was in New York. And if I go to my bank or my brokerage account, I can see my activity for the last 5 years. I've only got one Social Security number. And every person alive is allowed to vote in this country, I believe, has only one Social Security number. And anybody who's actually doing any kind of fraud with more than one Social Security number is not going to be in a hurry to vote more than once and call attention to themselves. So somehow or another, this should be able to be tied to our Social Security number, and after our vote is cast, be able to be printed out so we can then go online and see that we're credited with the vote that we requested. And I don't know if a person should have a PIN or somehow or another. This is really Mickey Mouse stuff given the technology advances that we have. And Norm Ornstein and Bill Gates should have a commission together.
Thanks, caller.
Well, not so quick. We don't want to compromise the secrecy of the ballot. That is fundamental to a working democracy. And if you are able to recapture your vote on the internet, it opens the door for coercion and fraud. If someone wanted to sell a vote, and we do know throughout history people have bought and sold things of value, including votes, if it's a secret ballot, at least the person who's trying to coerce you or purchase your vote won't know what you did behind that curtain. But if your boss, your spouse, or the person offering you money is able to get a verification of how you voted, that's a dangerous state to be in.
Las Vegas, good morning. What's your question?
Yes, Representative Holt. I've noticed that on your bill you made a statement that anybody that comes into a voting booth and does not have identification or they're not listed on the rolls should be given a provisional vote and it should be counted. Now, if that's the case, you must be a proponent of identification for a voter to come to the booth. Is that right?
I beg your pardon. I was unclear. First of all, the bill that Susan was speaking about, H.R. 550, deals only with the voter-verified paper audit trail and a required random audit, and the fact that these electronic machines cannot be connected to the internet, cannot have wireless connections, and so forth. I also have other legislation that says that provisional ballots, which are required under the Help America Vote Act, which is law now, that these provisional ballots must not only be provided to the voter, but must be counted if, and I failed to say this, if the voter is determined to be an eligible voter. Of course, the reason you cast a provisional ballot is so that the election officials will then have the opportunity to determine the validity of your registration.
And what about, in general, requiring of photo IDs at the polls?
The election laws should be directed toward ensuring the franchise and enlarging the franchise, to make sure that all eligible citizens have the opportunity to vote and are in no way discouraged from it. For example, requiring driver's licenses effectively discourages some people from voting. They don't drive, they don't have the money to get the driver's license. There should be, and the courts have been clear on this, no poll tax. You should not have to pay money to be able to vote. So you should not have to pay money to have the wherewithal, the identification or whatever it is, to vote. Of course, we want to make sure that there are citizens that vote. But in this country today, there is a much bigger problem with disenfranchisement of voters than there is of people illegally or fraudulently masquerading as citizens and voting.
Next phone call for you. We have about 5 minutes left in this conversation. Is from Spring, Texas. Independent. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate America. We finally got a working man in there, and a smart one to boot. I'm hoping you're honest. Good luck.
Thank you. I'll do my best.
Germantown, Tennessee, Republican line.
Yes, good morning. There's a couple of things that I think that you're leaving out. Disenfranchising honest and legal voters are also being jeopardized. There is very little in your bill that will protect legal voters. It's mostly provisional. There's very difficult. Now, in the city of Tennessee, Memphis, there was so much illegal voting, dead people voting. And this is when Harold Ford's aunt was running, and her family were voting in precincts that they weren't even supposed to be voting in. You have opened the door, and your legislation and all the others with this provisional and fraud and felons, who can vote. Tell people what felons are. They're murderers. And I would like to see people, rapists and child molesters, that y'all are allowing out of jail to get to vote. And in every inner city, this illegal and fraudulent voting has been going on in rampant numbers. And I think that now is the time for victims' rights people to come out and tell y'all it's enough is enough. You should have identification. There is no reason why these people can't get identification. I can stand in line for hours. So can anybody else. You can get your voting card before you go to vote. You can register. There's no reason with all the information out there that people who want to vote can register to vote. You and your group have done more to harm and promote fraud in voting than any group I've seen in my lifetime.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. Well, it's just to do away with illegal and fraudulent voting that is our motivation here, and to see that voters who are eligible have access to the polls and are not turned away from the polls, are not discouraged, so that there are adequate voting systems, that there are not long lines that effectively prohibit people from voting, for example.
Next phone call is from Bunch, Oklahoma, Democrats line.
Good morning, Susan.
Good
How
morning.
are you? Dr. Holt.
Yes, sir.
Good to see you, sir. I watch you all the time. I watch C-SPAN, and I see you on the House floor, and it's good to have someone with your intellect and integrity. I have a suggestion. Here in Oklahoma for the last several years, we have used a machine called OPTECH. It's OPTECH, and it's only about the size of a small portable typewriter. It's not hooked up to any phone lines or anything. They have a voter list. In the primaries, they have a Republican book and a Democrat book. When you come in, your name is in that book, you sign in. If your name's not in the book, you can't vote. Even though you have a voter ID card, if your name's not in the book, you can't vote. No one complains. Well, yes, I guess they do, but it doesn't do any good. But anyway, in the general election, they have one ballot, and it has arrows pointing toward each candidate, like for state representative or something, or for, well, if it's a U.S. representative, they'll have the Democrat and the Republican, and then there's an arrow, and that arrow has a space in it. They give you a black pen, an ink pen, it's kind of like a Sharpie, and you fill in that space.
Okay, so does the system work for you? What's the point?
Well, the system works good because we have no problems in Oklahoma with that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But my legislation does not prescribe a particular voting system. It just requires, this is H.R. 550 that I'm talking about, it just requires that each voter in the privacy of the voting booth be presented with a paper trail, a representation of the ballot that shows how the voter voted, so the voter can say, yes, that's right, push the submit vote, and then that record is stored. Not just in an electronic memory that might be in error, but on paper. You know, as it is now, without a voter-verified paper trail, the voter can leave the voting booth not knowing whether, because of some electronic error in the system, the vote was recorded in error. Could be a software bug, could be fraudulent hacking. If there is a voter-verified paper trail, the voter will know that it's recorded properly, and it is that vote that is the vote of record. You know, and with regard to, you say if the person's name is not on the registration list, the person can't vote. Under HAVA, under the Help America Vote Act, if a voter thinks that she or he should be on the registration list, that person is allowed to vote provisionally on a provisional ballot whose validity is later determined. And that's because the purging of the registration list has been a very denying legal voters the opportunity to vote. And so not all registration lists are accurate, and that's what we need to guard against and provide correction for.
What percentage of the 50 secretaries of state have supported your legislation?
A few, and more and more. At first, I think they saw this as just additional paperwork for them. But as they realize that there are elections that they just can't resolve the problems, there's something wrong with the electronic count, but they don't know what it is, they realize they need an audit trail. And of course, the only reasonable audit trail is what the voter herself or himself verifies.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you very much for ending our program with us this morning.
Thank you, Susan.
As you suggest, if not during the lame duck session, this will be a priority after January.
I think so.